Johnson, ladies and gentlemen. You know what it is to have somebody feeding you the lines? What else would you like me to say about it?
I like to hear nice things, because you always hear bad things most of your life.
They don't
hear people say nice.
In 1967, NBC executives almost rejected a 5'4" actor because he looked too strange for television. His name was Arte Johnson, and he was working at a Beverly Hills clothing store selling suits to celebrities. But when Laugh-In needed fresh faces, they took a chance on him. What happened next shocked everyone. Johnson didn't just act, he completely hijacked American television. He created 38 different characters, each with their own voice and catchphrase. One character became so controversial, it sparked death threats and FBI investigations. This is how one forgotten actor secretly rewrote the rules of comedy. By 1967, George Schlatter had already been working in television for several years. He wasn't a household name yet, but he was gaining respect for producing TV specials with stars like Dinah Shore. Still, his career wasn't safe. Television was changing fast. Big shows like Gunsmoke and The Lucy Show were dominating the ratings. NBC was desperate. They had nothing strong enough to compete, especially on Monday nights. One NBC executive, Herb Schlosser, admitted they were struggling badly. They needed something bold, something that didn't feel like every other show. Schlatter showed up at the exact right time with an idea that was strange, risky, and totally different from anything on TV. NBC didn't love it, but they were out of options. They gave him a chance, not because they believed in the show, but because they had nothing better. Before Laugh-In, Schlatter's career had already hit rough patches. In the early 1960s, he spent time in nightclubs in Las Vegas, working with entertainers who sometimes had shady ties. He later said it took him over a year to cut ties with some of those people. In 1963, he got a big break with The Judy Garland Show on CBS, but it didn't last. By 1964, he was fired and replaced by director Norman Jewison. By the time 1967 came around, he had experience, but not much success. So when he pitched Laugh-In, it wasn't just a show idea. It was his last shot at proving he belonged in the business. When he brought Laugh-In to the networks, every single one rejected it, except NBC. And even NBC didn't want it at first. They only bought it as a last-minute replacement. Schlatter later said the show was never supposed to exist. It was a total accident. The network only agreed because they needed something to fill a gap after they canceled The Man from UNCLE. They didn't think it would work, and they were nervous about the content. The sketches were fast, political, and had sexual undertones. They even assigned 5 censors to monitor the show closely. But something unexpected happened. When it aired as a one-time special on September 9th, 1967, audiences loved it. Suddenly, this strange little show became NBC's biggest surprise. Schlatter didn't come up with the idea by following American TV trends. He was inspired by underground comedy clubs and European theater that pushed boundaries. He wanted to take the feeling of sit-ins, love-ins, and protest movements and turn that wild energy into comedy. He had seen how avant-garde theater in Europe could shock people awake, using bold sounds, images, and themes. He mixed that with the chaotic humor he'd witnessed in Las Vegas clubs. What came out was Laugh-In, a show that broke every rule and didn't care about tradition. The show was never meant to be a series. It started as a single special. Some sources mention the original title might have been Laugh-In at the Ritz, but what's certain is that the name was inspired by 1960s culture. Sit-ins, love-ins, be-ins. That's why it was called a laugh-in. Dan Rowan even explained it that way in the first episode. He said it wasn't just a show, it was a frame of mind. Once it aired, the reaction was so strong that NBC quickly turned it into a regular series. Within months, it took over the Monday night slot left open by the man from UNCLE, and television was never the same. Not everyone on the show had an easy start. Arte Johnson, who would later become one of Laugh-In's biggest stars, was almost rejected completely. He stood just 5'4" and didn't look like a typical TV actor. Executives thought he looked too strange. Johnson had been born in 1929 in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and worked as a character actor doing using strange voices and accents. His odd style worked against him at first, but Schlatter saw something special. Johnson's weirdness was exactly what the show needed. Before Laugh-In, Johnson's career had crashed. He ended up working at a men's clothing store in Beverly Hills called Carol & Co. Students. It catered to celebrities, but for him, it felt like failure. One day, comedian Mort Saul came into the store and asked what he was buying. Johnson had to tell him, "I ain't buying, I'm selling." It crushed him, but the store's owner, Dick Carroll, believed in him. Carroll used to work in publicity at Warner Brothers, and he had connections. Every time someone important came in, he'd point to Johnson and say, "This guy shouldn't be working here. He should be in movies." Then one day, MGM actually called the store, looking for Johnson. Carroll told him to go right away. That phone call changed everything. When Schlatter was casting Laugh-In, he didn't want big names. Big stars meant big salaries and less control, so he hired unknowns. Arte Johnson, Ruth Buzzy, Goldie Hawn, Lily Tomlin. None of them were famous in 1968, but that was the point. Schlatter wanted fresh faces, so the show itself would shine, and it worked. The cast brought a raw energy that bigger stars might have avoided. They became famous because of the show, not the other way around. By September 1968, Laugh-In had exploded into one of the most popular shows on television. Johnson's most famous character, the German soldier Wolfgang, didn't come from acting school. It came from real life. Johnson grew up in Chicago around immigrant neighborhoods, and he picked up on different accents, especially German ones. The voice felt natural to him. The character's famous line, "very interesting," was inspired by the 1942 movie Desperate Journey, where Reagan and Flynn fought Nazis. Johnson often joked that the only real German he ever knew was his wife, but the character became iconic. In 1969, Johnson won an Emmy for it, proving that being a little weird could be exactly what America wanted. Back in the 1960s, most television shows moved slowly. Comedy was safe, predictable, and full of long pauses. But when Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In premiered on January 22, 1968, at 8:00 p.m. on NBC, everything changed in a flash. Viewers had never seen anything like it. The show hit the screen like a thunderstorm. Jokes came flying one after another so fast that people barely had time to breathe. They called it the shotgun method because it felt like the show was firing comedy straight at the viewer, non-stop. In every episode, dozens of scenes and voices and faces would flash across the screen, switching faster than most people could keep up with. It wasn't just funny, it was chaotic, colorful, and alive. NBC executives were nervous at first. They thought people wouldn't understand what was going on. They thought the rapid-fire editing with wild angles and strange sound effects would confuse everyone. But the opposite happened. The audience couldn't get enough. They stayed glued to their seats, afraid to look away and miss the next joke. One critic said it was like watching The Ed Sullivan Show on an LSD trip, and they weren't far off. The numbers behind the show were shocking. Each episode had over 400 jokes filmed, but only about 60 made it into the final cut. That meant most of what they created never aired, but it gave the show a tight, fast rhythm that felt like nothing else. On average, viewers were hit with a new joke every 12 seconds. That's 5 jokes per minute, faster than nearly any show before or after. Some comedy experts later called this mainlined comedy because it felt like the laughs were being injected straight into your bloodstream. It took decades for any show to come close to that pace. Even modern shows like Veep or 30 Rock rarely hit that joke per minute speed. Most sitcoms still only manage 3 or 4. The energy wasn't just in the jokes, it was in the set too. What people didn't know was that all this was being filmed inside an abandoned airplane hangar. That's where they built the wildest set on TV. The famous joke wall, with its swinging doors and neon colors, was part of a $1 million psychedelic playground. They covered the walls in vibrant patterns that screamed flower power and the summer of love. The place had secret tunnels, moving parts, and painted doors everywhere. It was like stepping into a cartoon that never stopped moving. Viewers had no idea it was all happening inside a forgotten aircraft building. They just knew it looked like nothing else on TV. The cast became legend. Goldie Hawn joined the show in the 4th episode and became a star almost overnight. And Arte Johnson's strange little character, Wolfgang, the one who popped out from behind a plant and whispered, "Very interesting," became iconic. But the truth behind Wolfgang was even more surprising. Johnson got the idea from a 1942 war movie called Desperate Journey, which starred Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan. There was a Nazi character who muttered something strange during an interrogation, and it stuck with Johnson. Even though he was just a small, bespectacled Midwesterner, barely 5'4", he turned that weird line into a piece of television history. He only made about $210 per episode back then, but the line became worth millions in pop culture. That catchphrase was so powerful, it sparked controversy too. Not everyone loved it. Johnson started getting hate mail, some of it brutal. The war had only ended 23 years earlier, and many Americans still felt raw about anything related to Germany. Some thought making a German soldier into a silly character was in bad taste. Johnson later joked that the only German he knew was his wife, and yet people kept begging him to say those two little words. Years later, he'd tell fans, "Sir, you just keep saying that, and maybe one day I'll be able to buy a Renoir." One of the biggest secrets behind the show's wild style was that it wasn't spontaneous at all. It only looked like chaos. Every moment was rehearsed again and again until it felt natural. Even the moments where actors burst out laughing were usually planned in advance. The cast practiced those reactions, making sure it all looked off the cuff. The show wasn't filmed in order either. They'd shoot sketches in random chunks, then piece them together later to give the illusion that anything could happen. The joke wall alone needed hours of blocking to make sure all the actors hit their marks at just the right time. To the audience, it felt unpredictable, but behind the scenes, it was one of the most carefully planned shows ever made. The success of Laugh-In didn't just launch careers, it helped kill off a whole style of television. Before 1968, the variety show ruled the airwaves. Ed Sullivan, with his jugglers and opera singers, was a Sunday night staple. But just 3 years after Laugh-In hit the screen, the Ed Sullivan Show ended in 1971. Critics said it was no accident. Compared to Laugh-In, those old shows felt like relics. The young audience didn't want 10-minute plate-spinning acts anymore. They wanted something fast, loud, funny, and unpredictable. Schlatter, the show's creator, said he gave a home to young character people who didn't have a place before. He tore down the old system and built something new in its place. Something built for speed, for color, for noise, for change. From 1968 to 1973, Laugh-In stayed on the air, shaping not just how comedy looked, but how it felt. Even after it ended, its fingerprints were all over sketch shows that came later. When Saturday Night Live began in 1975, people immediately saw the connection. And today, if you scroll through short YouTube comedy clips or TikTok sketches with lightning cuts and no time to breathe, you're still seeing the legacy of Laugh-In. In 1968, something happened on American television that no one expected. Richard Nixon, the man who had lost the 1960 election to John F. Kennedy and was now trying to come back, showed up on a comedy show. The show was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and it was the most watched show in the country at the time. Over 31 million people were tuning in every week. It was fast, loud, colorful, and filled with jokes, sketches, and weird characters. It was not the kind of place anyone expected to see a serious politician like Nixon, but Nixon did appear, and he only said 4 words. He looked into the camera and said, "Sock it to me?" It was strange, awkward, and quick, but it shocked the country. No one had ever seen a presidential candidate do something like that before. And behind that one short clip was a wild story full of panic, secrecy, and fear. The producer of the show, George Schlatter, had to film Nixon's line in total secrecy. Even Nixon's own team didn't want him to do it. They thought it made him look foolish. Nixon had to try 6 times before before he got it right. He kept saying it with an angry tone. The show's host, Dick Martin, said Nixon looked so nervous that he just kept licking his lips over and over. As soon as they finished the take, Schlatter grabbed the footage and ran out of the studio. He didn't walk, he ran. He was scared Nixon's team would change their minds and try to stop the clip from ever being shown. That short moment aired on September 16, 1968, just 2 months before the election, and it worked. Nixon's image had always been cold and stiff. People remembered how awkward he looked in the 1960 debates, but now he looked like someone with a sense of humor. It was only 5 seconds long, but those 5 seconds helped change how people saw him. Dick Martin believed it helped Nixon win the election. That night, Nixon's team also paid for a full campaign ad to air during the same episode. It was the smartest media move they made, and Nixon, like any guest, was paid the usual appearance fee, $210. That tiny amount of money may have bought him the presidency. At the same time, Vice President Hubert Humphrey was also invited to do the exact same thing, say the same words, but he said no. His team said it was beneath the dignity of a serious politician. That one choice cost him dearly. Humphrey missed the chance to speak directly to 31 million viewers. Later, people close to him said it may have been the biggest mistake of his entire campaign. Another candidate, George Wallace, was also asked and declined. That left Nixon as the only major candidate willing to take the risk. He took the joke seriously, and the gamble paid off. There was another character on Laugh-In who added to the madness. His name was Wolfgang. He was played by Arte Johnson and dressed like a confused German soldier who didn't know the war had ended. He'd pop out from behind a plant and say, "Very interesting, but stupid." That line became famous. He used it to comment on everything, even politics. In a strange way, having Nixon on the show while a German soldier character was creeping around in the background added an absurd and ironic twist. Americans still had deep connections to World War II, so putting a German soldier next to American politics made people laugh, but also feel something deeper. Wolfgang became more than just a silly character. He changed how people viewed the war. In 1968, only 23 years had passed since World War II ended. Veterans were still watching. Families who had lost loved ones were still grieving. But somehow, this clueless German soldier made it okay to laugh. Arte Johnson once said people were still deeply connected to that war. And that's why Wolfgang struck a nerve. He wasn't evil. He was harmless and lost. For many people, that made the war feel a little less painful. The impact of Wolfgang didn't stop there. Saturday Night Live began in 1975, and the creators admitted they had studied Laugh-In. They learned how to create recurring characters who kept showing up every week. People tuned in just to see what they would say next. Wolfgang's success taught them how to use comedy to shape how people saw real political figures. Chevy Chase later played Gerald Ford as clumsy and bumbling, and the country believed it. That idea came straight from Wolfgang's playbook. Make them laugh and they'll remember. Wolfgang's face and voice became so popular that companies started making toys and helmets based on the character. Kids wore plastic German helmets with fake cigarettes and repeating catchphrases. Stores sold over 100,000 of those helmets, but not everyone was laughing. Veteran groups were furious. They said it made fun of the sacrifices soldiers had made. Some even organized boycotts of the merchandise. Vietnam veterans against the war also protested, saying it turned symbols of fascism into jokes. But despite the backlash, sales kept climbing. The anger wasn't just about toys. Arte Johnson began getting death threats. Hundreds of letters poured in, many from W202 veterans who thought Wolfgang insulted their pain. Some German-American groups were also upset. They felt the character made them look bad. The FBI got involved after Johnson received over a dozen serious threats. In 1969, armed protesters even tried to break into NBC studios while the show was filming. It was no longer just a TV show. It was a symbol, and symbols can be dangerous. Still, Johnson didn't stop. He said the character had become bigger than him. It had taken on a life of its own, and in a way, it had. Wolfgang's catchphrase, "very interesting," became so famous that by 1972, it was added to Webster's dictionary. Johnson had taken the line from a 1942 Errol Flynn film, but when he said it in a German accent, it became something completely new. He was shocked it caught on. He once said, "I couldn't believe that two words, a total non sequitur, would have that kind of impact." It was more than just a phrase. It showed how TV could shape the way people talked, laughed, and even voted. In just a few years, Laugh-In had changed what comedy could do. It helped Nixon win an election. It helped America laugh at its darkest moments. It made a forgotten soldier into a household name. And it turned a silly phrase into something people still remember decades later. All of it happened between 1968 and 1973. During some of the hardest years in American history, there were protests in the streets, soldiers dying in Vietnam, and leaders being assassinated. But inside that colorful TV box, something strange and funny was happening. And whether people loved it or hated it, they couldn't stop watching. Arte Johnson changed television comedy in a way that no one saw coming. When he joined Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In 1967, he didn't just act. He completely transformed how people thought about sketch comedy. He didn't play just one role. He played dozens, jumping from one wild character to the next in the blink of an eye. That kind of fast-paced switching hadn't been done like that before, and people loved it. One moment, he was a clueless German soldier named Wolfgang. The next, he was Tyrone, an old man trying to flirt. Then he became Piotr, a strange Soviet refugee. These weren't just quick gags. They were full characters with voices, movements, and catchphrases. It was all happening at lightning speed, right in front of live audiences. This caught the attention of a young comedy writer named Lorne Michaels. He worked on Laugh-In from 1968 to 1973. When that show ended, Michaels didn't forget what he saw. Just 2 years later, in 1975, he created Saturday Night Live, and it was clear where the idea came from. Johnson's way of bouncing between characters, switching personalities in seconds, became the heart of SNL. The show's energy, its jumpy pace, the feeling that anything could happen next. It all traced back to Johnson. By the time Johnson won an Emmy in 1969, he had already laid down the rules for what sketch comedy would look like for the next 50 years. During his time on Laugh-In, from 1968 to 1973, Johnson created 38 recurring characters. That number alone was unheard of, but it wasn't just the number. Each character felt alive. They had their own voices, catchphrases, and even their own walk. People could instantly recognize Wolfgang's famous line, "Very interesting, but stupid." It became so popular that even kids watching Sesame Street in 1970 and 1971 saw him appear. Later, in 1980, he brought that same character to 3-2-1 Contact. That meant children who hadn't even been born during Laugh-In still grew up hearing that line. His style didn't disappear after the 70s. You could see it again and again in Living Color from 1990 to 1994, in Mad TV from 1995 to 2009, and in Key and Peele from 2012 to 2015. Every one of those shows had quick character swaps, silly accents, and outrageous facial expressions that felt like Johnson all over again. Each of those shows followed the same playbook he wrote decades earlier. You could almost feel his fingerprints on every scene, every punchline, every strange wig and costume. But Johnson didn't just change sketch comedy. He completely rewrote how TV commercials work. Before he joined Laugh-In 1967, he had already made a name for himself in the advertising world, and not by doing what everyone else was doing. Johnson was famous for changing accents, body language, and even age, all in the same 30-second commercial. Advertisers noticed. By 1970, companies were begging for actors who could do Johnson-style commercials. Suddenly, it became normal for one actor to play several characters in one ad. By 1975, more than 60% of TV commercials were using this rapid character switching method. Trade magazines even started calling it Laugh-In style advertising. It was a big deal. Johnson had turned a goofy TV technique into a business revolution. Out of all his characters, Wolfgang lasted the longest. He was the German soldier who didn't know the war was over. It started as a joke, but it stuck around for decades. He brought Wolfgang to Sesame Street in 1970, then again to 3-2-1 Contact in 1980. And in the 1990s, even big movies like Wayne's World in 1992 and Austin Powers in 1997 made direct jokes about him. His voice, his look, even his little smirk, it all lived on. In the 2000s, Johnson voiced a new version of that character for the show Justice League Unlimited, playing a man named Vermin Wunderbar, clearly inspired by Wolfgang. And long after Laugh-In was off the air, writers kept slipping Wolfgang-style characters into sitcoms and sketches, using his voice and style as shorthand for silly European villains.